Martin Luther was one of the greatest thinkers of the Renaissance. He was born and lived most of his life in Germany, apparently a place far away from the core of the Renaissance, Italy, Spain. But what happened at that point, in 1516, when he published his 99 Theses, was that the Catholic Church was perceived as tremendously corrupt and oppressive. There was a religious and political problem with the northern kingdoms of Europe, Germany, England, the lower countries. The presence of Spain, of the Pope, was resented for many reasons, and at the same time, a true Christian like Luther could not oversee that there was a need to reform the church, and he protested against the corruption and the dictatorial powers of the church. So he was excommunicated, he was separated from the church, he was declared heretic. However, he was very successful with the dissemination of his ideas, and he created a schism in Christianity. Catholic countries, Spain, Italy, France, marched against the Protestant countries, Germany, and later in the form of Anglican Protestantism, England. Martin Luther King created the possibility of reading and interpreting the Bible directly without the intermediation of church officials. This is a huge claim in favor of individual thought, of direct reflection, personal relationship with God. At the same time, in 1516, Erasmus, a Dutch thinker who never separated from the Catholic Church, was publishing his Institutio Principis Christiani, the institution of the Christian prince, a treatise dedicated to the young Charles V, who had just assumed the kingdoms of Germany and soon later Spain, also known as Charles of Habsburg, Charles I in Spain, Charles V in Germany. Erasmus advised the politician. Erasmus told Charles, the prince, how to conduct himself, how to carry out the mission that God had put on his shoulders, which was the creation of the kingdom of God on earth. This sounds a little bit idealistic and utopian. However, for the people at that time, it was the right thing to do. Erasmus tried to reform the church from within, and he somehow managed to do it. He coincided in many ways with the English Thomas More, who published in 1516 his work Utopia, the no place, the place that is not real. However, it summarizes all the ideals of equality and lack of ambition that the European courts and kingdoms lacked at that time. And together with Erasmus, Thomas More, and Luther, we have the Italian Machiavelli. Niccolò Machiavelli published The Prince, probably one of the most important political treatises of all times. As opposed to Erasmus, who claimed that the prince should follow a philosophia Christi, a philosophy based on the Gospels, act as if he was Christ himself. Machiavelli was a little bit more pragmatic, more cynical. He advised the prince to act in the interest of the state. The mission of the prince is to stay in power. Of course, try to be fair, try to be honest, but sometimes that's not possible because you have to confront many enemies that are not going to be fair or honest with you. And if you play all the time fair, you might be easily defeated. So famous pieces of advice like to divide is to reign, for example, or the goal justifies the means, that sounds like amoral today. Well, they also sounded amoral then, and created a trend in political practice that was perceived as non-human, as cynical, as deviated from the Gospels. Nonetheless, Machiavelli was very successful, even in Spain. The successor of Charles V, his son Philip II, was known in many ways for having some Machiavellian practices. His grandfather, King Ferdinand, was probably the inspiration of Machiavelli. So there is a line of kings and politicians and important authorities that acted according to the need to stay in power. And that is called Machiavellism still today. As you can see, the Renaissance is still alive. Just take a look at many of our politicians and you will probably see some of the features that Machiavelli saw in the princes of his own century.